I want to talk about one of the more distinctive narrative modes in Jane Austen's Persuasion, a method by which Austen chooses to present her characters, in particular Anne Elliot, the main character of the novel, of course. And this mode of narration is known as free indirect speech, sometimes called free indirect discourse or free indirect style. Jane Austen, many think, actually invented this mode of storytelling. So, because it's such an important mode in the novel, and because its effects, rhetorical effects, let's say, really, I think, shape our understanding of the novel, it's worth going into what free indirect discourse is. So, what is direct discourse? Direct discourse occurs when an author actually puts a character's thoughts or language in quotation marks and either precedes or follows with he said, she said, generally. So, for instance, Anne was very agitated after seeing the captain. She thought, I wonder if he still loves me. So we see in that example that Anne's thought is directly expressed in quotation marks. What is indirect speech? Well, indirect speech occurs when the author reports on what was being said or thought. An example of indirect speech would be Anne was agitated upon seeing the captain. She wondered if he still loved her. So you see the author simply reporting indirect speech. Now, what does free indirect speech sound like? Anne was agitated after seeing the captain. Did he still love her? So you can see that instead of the author actually quoting what Anne is thinking, or instead of the author actually reporting on what Anne is thinking, the author renders what Anne is thinking, but in a way that kind of blurs the boundary between the character's consciousness and the point of view of the narrator. So free and direct discourse is really it's another way to think of it is one character's consciousness rendered in third person as opposed to first person. I think I'm going to the store. That's first person. He's going to the store would be third person, obviously. But if in my head, if I were a character in a novel, the author might say, Eric thought he would go to the store. He wanted to buy something. Would he need eggs? Eggs. Yes, eggs. He needed eggs. So you can see that my mind would work in such a way as to think eggs, eggs. But again, the author is in control, let's say, of that inner discourse and not simply allowing me, if I were a character, to use my own voice, my own first person. So let's look at an example of free indirect speech in Jane Austen's Persuasion. There are many examples. Almost always the free indirect discourse is used in relation to Anne Elliot. In fact, this novel is quite remarkable in that we see most of the action through the eyes of Anne Elliot, most of the action through her eyes, often when she's not actually speaking or participating in the scene. It's a very odd novel in that it's about watching and thinking and interpreting more so than acting. But in chapter 2, volume 2, chapter 8, or chapter 20 in your Penguin, we have many instances. This is a major scene when she is in Bath and she sees Captain Wentworth at the concert sponsored by Lady Dalrymple. And he treats her for the first time since they've reunited with a kindness and an interest that he has not shown heretofore. And she starts thinking that he has renewed his affection for her. So he's had this conversation with her. She's having to move. They've parted ways, and she can't get that conversation out of her mind. So here's how Austen renders it. The free and direct discourse really comes in strongly at the very end, but even before, even when she's using what seems to be indirect discourse, She uses punctuation that suggests agitation. So even the indirect discourse, it very closely approaches free indirect discourse. Um, Anne saw nothing, thought nothing of the brilliancy of the room. Her happiness was from within. Her eyes were bright and her cheeks glowed, but she knew nothing about it. She was thinking only of the last half hour, and as they passed to their seats, her mind took a hasty range over it. His choice of subjects, his expressions, and still more his manner and look had been such as she could see in only one light: his opinion of Louisa Musgrove's inferiority, an opinion which he had seemed solicitous to give, his wonder at Captain Benwick, his feelings as to a first strong attachment, sentences begun which he could not finish, his half averted eyes and more than half expressive glance, all declared that he had a heart returning to her at last. A heart returning to her at least, that anger, resentment, avoidance were no more, and that they were succeeded not merely by friendship and regard, but by the tenderness of the past. Yes, some share of the tenderness of the past. She could not contemplate the change as implying less, he must love her. That line at the very end, he must love her. That is, of course, a thought that she has in her head, but Austen renders it in the third person. That's just a classic moment of free and direct discourse. But again, leading up to it, the syntax and the punctuation suggesting the kind of fragmentation that would come with being excited. It's clear that Austen is trying to capture the rhythms of how her character Anne's mind would work in such a state of agitation. So really the whole paragraph has the feel of free and direct speech. Again, with the last line, very overtly being an example of free and direct speech. So why is it so important? Obviously, it's important for thinking about Jane Austen's novel, but I just want to think about what this mode does to our experience of a story. First of all, we have a difficult time telling the difference in these cases between the narrator's point of view and the character's point of view. If we were reading a traditional 18th century novel, say Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, this novel is rendered in indirect speech for the most part. It is an example of the narrator as an omniscient third person, a sort of eye in the sky who tells the stories of the characters without necessarily siding with one or the other, but simply trying to be transparent and rendering the characters as they are. Then if you look at another famous novel of the 18th century, Pamela by Samuel Richardson, well, this entire novel is rendered in letters. Letters from the protagonist, Pamela, primarily, but other letters too. So we see first person. It's almost all direct speech. So Austen comes in the middle. And the distinction between the character and the narrator is ambiguous. It's very clear in the other two kinds of novels that I've just described. So is the narrator objective in Jane Austen's Persuasion? Well, sometimes the narrator seems to be objective, simply reporting what's going on. But other times the narrator seems to be on the side of Anne. So as we read, we don't quite know where to position the authority of the novel. Is it with the narrator? Is it with Anne? Is it somewhere in between? Of course, if the narrator's point of view is ambiguous, so is the character's. When Anne thinks, are her thoughts, or are they the narrator's thoughts? Again, in the fictional world, so we don't quite know where the source of her thoughts come from either. So ambiguity is very much at play in free and direct speech. What's another effect of it? Clearly, Austen can render the thoughts of her characters in a much more immediate way with free and direct speech. It's almost like stream of consciousness. It's not quite there. It's almost like stream of consciousness. And in fact, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, two of the early innovators in stream of consciousness, often use free and direct speech. So you get a much more direct, immediate, raw experience of a character's point of view. The distance between you and that character's psyche is really collapsed. So I would say that these three factors together create a fourth overall factor, and that is that free and direct discourse creates a kind of psychological realism. I think it captures how minds actually work. When we think, we're constantly kind of blending interior speech that seems to be our speech with exterior voices that seem to come from somewhere else. So a mind itself is this melding of kind of different perspectives, different authorities, at conflict with one another, sometimes merging with one another. So all in all, this novel Persuasion is really one of the first of its kind, with the heavy use of the free and direct speech. And what do we see in it but a novel that's very supple, and very alert to the fluxes of consciousness, much more so than attentive to the outcomes of physical actions.